We continue through Acts. Here we are making our way to the finish line. Today we're looking at Acts 21 through chapter 23 because we were on a holiday weekend. Yesterday was Memorial Day. So here in Acts 21 through 23, this is really where we find Paul return to Jerusalem. What is waiting for him? What is waiting for him there? What transpires while he is there? So picking up back in chapter 21, we can see this records the final leg of Paul's third missionary journey, and where he reaches his destination, his goal to get back to Jerusalem. And the first three verses, we can see it's a travel portion. He went to this place, he went to this place, this place, he went to this place. Because again, Luke is very detailed, and he is a historian, and so he is recording all these details. And one of the good things about how detailed Luke is about, he gives the titles of the people and their positions, locations, is that we can verify these facts that he gives. And so Luke holds up very well as a historian. His writings, especially Acts, are all the details that we can verify. Check out. So this only lends itself to the credibility and the authenticity of his writing, especially the book of Acts. So after that, in verses 4 through 6, we can see Paul's at Tyre, and he meets with the disciples there. We can see if he's going to be at a place where they know there are Christians, they usually meet up and join together and encourage one another. And here, the disciples in Tyre are like, don't go to Jerusalem. Like, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And the Holy Spirit continues to tell people who continue to tell Paul, like, if you go to Jerusalem, it's not going to work out. Like, bad is waiting for you there. But Paul's like, nope, I'm going. So he continues on his journey. In verses 7 through 14, he's in Caesarea. Philip, we remember Philip, right? Back from earlier in Acts, he has settled in Caesarea. He's got 4 daughters who are prophetesses. That's a fun detail. Nothing really else is said about them or anything that they do, but Luke gives us that detail. And so that's a fun thing. Agabus comes and he prophesies in a very dramatic way. Ezekiel would be very proud of this kind of prophecy, or Elijah or Elisha, because a lot of their prophecies were dramatic. Ezekiel especially, goodness, some of the things that he did to prophesy. But so he binds himself with Paul's belt and says this is what's going to happen to who owns this belt if they go to Jerusalem. But Paul is intent nonetheless. So in verses 15 through 19, he makes it to Jerusalem and he shares with the church leaders, James, the half-brother of Jesus, the elders, and he shares what all God is doing. And so they're encouraged by the work. Again, we need to share. When God is doing things, when God moves in our lives, when God answers a prayer, when good things are happening, we need to share and encourage with each other. And here we can see churches help churches. It's not like, well, we've been in Jerusalem doing our own thing, Paul. Like, that's cool, bye. No, they're very concerned. They want to hear it builds up the whole church when churches in other locations are doing well. When people are coming into Christ, that's good for everybody. But the leaders in Jerusalem, they have a plan. They're like, look, Paul, here's what people have been saying about you. We know it's not true, so here's our plan. And there's these 4 Christians who are observing a vow. Paul has already done this. It's some kind of Nazirite vow. They're observing this vow, and the time for it to be fulfilled is come. And so they're like, Paul, look, you take them, you pay their expenses, you pay for their sacrifices, and you purify yourself with them so that people will see that, like, you're a good Jew. Like, you're not telling people that, running around telling all the Jews to stop being Jews. And so if you want some background on Nazirite vows, you can go to Numbers chapter 6 in the Old Testament. And you can read about it there. Now, we don't know anything else about these vows. It's some kind of, they separated themselves. It's a form of fasting for a specific purpose for a set amount of time. That's all that we can infer from what we have. And so Paul does this, and he's in the temple, and they're going through this, and some of the Jews from Asia that were stirring up trouble for Paul when he's on his missionary journeys recognize him, and they're like, no. So I actually have in my notes that the Jews from abroad be crazy. They're just crazy. And so they cause a riot. Paul is really good at this. This might be a spiritual gift that we need to recognize, the ability to cause riots. That's a joke. That's not a real spiritual gift. But cause this riot, and they've seen Paul associate with some Greeks, and they're like, oh, he brought them into the temple. Of course, it's a baseless, ridiculous accusation. That's a very serious thing, though, for a Gentile to go into the Jewish portions of the temple. Like, there were signs that we have that say, like, if you do this, your death is on your own head, okay? Not our fault. So this is a very serious thing. Paul never did this, but to them, this is a very serious thing. So they cause this big riot. Everybody's all in an uproar. The Romans, the soldiers who are stationed there in the city, they're like, people are going crazy. What's going on? They go to investigate. They can't figure anything out. And so they get Paul and stop the crowd from beating him and kind of get him into safety. So we see Rome here. Rome protects the gospel. You don't think God can use anything and anyone? Don't think God's all powerful? Well, look at this. The most powerful nation in the world, God is using them to further the gospel, and actually uses them so that Paul can preach the gospel. Because in verses 37 through 40, Paul tells this Roman soldier, hey, I want to address the crowd. Can I do that? And he's like, okay. And so Paul addresses them in Hebrew. Or in Aramaic. Hebrew dialect is what it says. So, he addresses the crowd. And then we're in chapter 22, and for verses 1 through 21, Paul is sharing his testimony. That's what he does. He shares his testimony. And what he's got working for him is that there are a lot of people there who know him, and that know that he used to be one way, but now he is follower of the way, which is what Christianity was called then. And that just goes to show that our testimonies can be powerful. And here Paul is, and he writes this in his letter, one of his letters to the church in Corinth. He says, look, to the Jews I'm a Jew, to the Gentiles I'm a Gentile. I'm going to be all things to all people so that I can win some. And this is the way Paul does ministry. And so he is speaking to Jews here, and he is playing up the fact that he is a Jew, and that he was a very strict Jew. He observed all the laws and the regulations to the letter. He was a Pharisee. He was zealous for God. And so he's playing this up, and he's playing up his vision, how Jesus appeared to him. He's just sharing his testimony here so that hopefully they can hear. He's trying to do everything he can to break down the barrier so that they can hear the gospel message. Well, as soon as he talks about preaching to the Gentiles, they lose their minds. And testimony is now over. And the Romans take Paul, and they learn that Paul is a Roman citizen. They're going to scourge him, which is what they did to Jesus before he was crucified, in order to find out more information. But Paul's like, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. We learn that he was born a Roman citizen. Now, not everybody who lived in Rome, the whole nation of Rome, was a Roman citizen. Either the soldier was like, I bought my citizenship, which you could do, but Paul was born into it. So he has a special status. Citizens had more rights and more protections than just people who happened to live in a, territory of Rome. And so Paul uses that to his advantage. But the Sanhedrin is going to meet so that they can try to figure out what is going on. Why is all this uproar being caused around Paul? So now we go into in chapter 23, and we see that Paul's situation becomes more pressing. So he is before the Sanhedrin, which is this Jewish court council, and they had lots of freedom from Rome to make many decisions and govern themselves, but there were, a few things that they could not do. And so we see in the first 5 verses, I have in my notes, Paul is feisty. Paul's like, look, I haven't done anything wrong. And so the high priest is like, hit him. And he gets hit, and then Paul's like, why are you hitting me? Why are you acting contrary to the law? And they're like, this is the high priest. And Paul's like, well, I didn't know that, because if I'd known that, then this is what the law says. So Paul's a little feisty here. And Paul can be feisty. And sometimes that's okay. But sometimes it's not. So please use wisdom and discretion. But in the first, then we move on to verses 6 through 10. Paul is wise. He realizes that he's got the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so if he distracts from him, he says, hey, I'm on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. And so the Pharisees who believe in the resurrection are like, whoa. And the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. And Luke gives us those details. This would be very helpful information to a Gentile audience. So he gives us these details to let us know why this fight occurs. So the Pharisees are like, whoa, if he had a vision from God, like that's a thing. The resurrection, like that's a thing. The Sadducees are like, no, that is not a thing. So now they get into a fight, and no one can figure out what's going on. So the Romans take him back away. In verse 11, we have just a testimony to God's faithfulness. God makes this promise to Paul. He's like, look, you're going to be my witness in Rome, okay? You're going to get there. I can promise you that. And then we go into verses 12 through 15, and Luke is building the narrative in such a way that we see God's faithfulness playing out. So he tells us God promised Paul that he was going to be faithful. And then he, in the very next verses, says, there's a plot to kill Paul. So the tension here, it's building drama. And so we can see that crafting the narrative while maintaining truth to the actual events, but they're crafting it in such a way that it helps us see what Luke wants us to see. And so in verses 12 through 15, there are these 40-something Jews who are like, we're going to kill Paul, and we're not going to sleep or eat or do anything else until we do that. So here's what you need to do, Sanhedrin. Tell them that you want to meet with Paul. When they bring him down, we're going to jump them, and we're going to kill them. We're going to kill Paul. So they're like, okay, but Paul's nephew overhears. So in verses 16 through 22, Paul's nephew comes and tells Paul, and then Paul's like, hey, you need to tell the Romans. And so he tells the Roman guards, and the plot is thwarted. Now, this is an interesting little detail into Paul's family. So Paul has a sister who has a son. We don't know anything else about that. We don't really get any insight into Paul's family. Was he married? Was he not married? That's actually a big debate among scholars. Doesn't really matter. How many siblings did he have? I don't know. But we know his dad was a Pharisee, because Paul said that he's the son of a Pharisee. And so we get some details in here. But again, that's not the point. The point is not what are all the details of Paul's family. We don't need to be distracted by that. The point is we see God's provision, that God uses Paul's nephew to keep the promise that he made Paul. God's plan cannot be thwarted. God's plan cannot be stopped. And he can use the most powerful nation in the world that doesn't really want the way, which is what Christianity is at this point, to spring up and grow, to cause it to spring up and grow, to give Paul more audience for sharing the gospel, because it is in Rome, actually, that Paul writes some of his most loved letters by us. Now, when we go to verses 23 through 35, we see that Paul's taken to Caesarea, and he is under guard. Such a guard that would, what is the word for it? There's a word for it, and I can't think of it, but it's the kind of guard that if you're going to jump this procession and you're going to try to kill Paul, you can't do that because there's too many soldiers. They got spears, they have cavalry. Like, this is dissuading them from acting. And so Paul is safely makes it to Caesarea. And there, he meets with Felix, who's the Roman governor. Think Pontius Pilate, only this is a new guy. This is Felix. And Felix is actually married to Herod Agrippa II's sister, Drusilla. So the Herods and this Roman governor, Felix, actually are united through marriage. But he is going to hear the case of Paul. Fun fact, Felix was also a former slave who won his freedom. There you go, little historical tidbit for you. Now, as we look through all these, I mean, this is a dramatic series of events here. This could be a movie where you wouldn't have to change all the details to make it dramatic, because it's dramatic. We got plots, we got twists and turns, there's battles, people getting beaten, we got all kinds of stuff happening here. What can we draw from this other than cool story like this happened, we see God's provision, like that's great, you know, the gospel is going to march on. What can we take from this? I think that as I reflect, it's obedience proves faith. Obedience, it proves faith. Faith is one of those things that has to be tested to know what you have. And when we obey God, that proves that we trust Him. We can't just say, oh, I have faith. It's when we obey that we prove our faith, that it is substantial and that it exists, that it's actually there. And we can see that in Paul. Paul is obedient. And that proves his faith, but we can see that God is also faithful. That's who He is. That's His character. So we, who also are empowered and indwelt by the Holy Spirit to be witnesses for Jesus Christ, that has not changed. We can move forward in confidence that God's will be done, and that God's plans cannot be thwarted, and that what God purposes will come to pass, because God is sovereign, and we have a testimony of that right here in the book of Acts.